and insights you as a trainer, or maybe even as a scientist or practitioner, can implement in your training. So we hope to inspire you and to broaden your perspective. And this episode I talked with Pascal Martens. We did a whole podcast in Dutch, but I would also like my international colleagues to get a little spark of it, because Brian Willis just coined my story with him, the Netherlands model of police training. And the Netherlands model, I'm not sure if there is a Netherlands model, but we have developed over the years a kind of core curriculum in which all use of force instructors are educated. And one of the pioneers here was Pascal Martens, I'm interviewing right now. And Pascal was a former use of force instructor. So for international audience, that means that we already did everything, so to speak. So it was not only defensive tactics, it was firearms, it was procedures, it was the police use of force and the law. So in Holland, we were educated in all those aspects and to educate our participants. So Pascal was one of the pioneers. He was self a use of force instructor, then became the instructor to train the trainer instructors for use of force instructors. And later on worked at the Police Academy at the Department of Knowledge and Science. And today he's working as, well, maybe you can answer that better, but I think as an advisor consultant for a advisory consultancy firm, in which you also do research to police as a learning organization and so on and so on. So Pascal, welcome. And to set the stage, Pascal and his colleagues came from a situation where it was very separated. So we had the firearms instructor, we had the defensive tactics instructor, and we had maybe a sport instructor. And then when you came along with other colleagues, it was the goal of to bridge the gap and to make a more coherent training model, isn't it? And then you developed this is difficult in English, the different phases of training, and we can talk about. So let's start with that. What did you?
Eric.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me and for your kind opening. We've been talking about the stages that you have in the learning method that we use in the Dutch police force. And we, exactly as you explained it, we used to come from a situation where the different aspects of use of force, but also the different aspects in the whole wide of police activities were trained separately. But there was this momentum, this focus to integrate all these aspects as a sort of holistic sort of training. In the end, it became too difficult to do the holistic training with everything and every aspect of a police that a police officer encounters. So it was more or less isolated within the use of force activities. And the method that we developed together with a college, a university in the Netherlands, was a method that started off with skills and knowledge training. So you'd learn the basic skills, and that could mean drawing your weapon from your holster, giving a low kick, or striking a punch, or using your handcuffs, stuff like that. So the basic skills that you need, but also the basic knowledge, like, for instance, regulation and law, but sometimes also medical knowledge, or maybe knowledge about the use of force techniques that you're using or applying. And in this stage, we'd require from the instructor that they would be like experts. So if you'd give a form of education, or you do a sort of exercise, you would look at it and you would qualify it as, this is exactly as I had it in my mind, or you would qualify it as wrong. This is not what I want. I want you to do something else, and I'm going to help you figure it out what the exact skill is about and how you use it in this context. But as that settles and you become adequate within the skills and the separate skills and the different knowledge parts that you need here, you go to a second stage. And this second stage is what we call role playing. And role playing is a setting where you have like the application of the skills and the knowledge that you'd learned in the prior phase. And it's like you'd make layers of the skills. And so what you'd also want to have in this setting is a more operational relevant context. And when the context is more relevant and it's more recognizable for the person who's applying the force, it becomes more easy to remember it when you're in the operational field. I think everybody would agree or would understand this. But in this phase, you'd have like an application of different skills together, and you'd have like different situations. So you would vary in the situations, but you'd also tell the student what the variation is. So for instance, if you'd say, we're going to enter this room, and when you walk into the room with your buddy, then there's a suspect on the bed sitting on the right side, and you're going to approach him and you're going to do this and you're going to do that. And you train that, and it's exactly as the instructor told, and the suspect acts exactly as the instructor prescribed. And then in a different situation, you make a little variation, say it's not on the right side this time, but he's on the left side, or he's standing in front of the bed, or when you approach the door will open and the suspect will come out of the room, and you'd have to approach him there. And these are the skills that you'd require to hold them in place or put on the handcuffs or whatever. So you'd really prescribe every aspect of the activity and of the range and the chain of skills that you'd like to connect. And when this is adequate, you go to the third phase, and the third phase, or the third stage, is what we call scenario training. And in the scenario training, you'd have more of a surprise, because you train one of the variations that you did in the role-playing environment, and the student or the buddy and the student would enter the room or approach the room and would not know which kind of variation would happen. So they have to make a decision. So at this point, the instructor also evaluates only the decision making, because then the police officers in training need to recognize the situation. So that would be part of the training. So recognizing what's happening here. Do I recognize it from the role-playing game that I did earlier? And can I act according to the role-playing game? And then you'd have like a neat and proper form of arrest, for instance. But it's important to see how the instructor evolves during these stages as well. So the stages evolve to more operational relevant context. It's becoming more complex, it's becoming more integrated and more layered. But the instructor develops from more or less an expert who says this is right, this is wrong, to more or less a coach who asks like what we'd call the interested question.
Yeah.
So I'm very interested in, why did you do this? I'm very interested in, why did you back away from the door when the suspect came out of the room? Why did you move to the left? Why did you move to the right? And it's without judgment. So the key here is to ask like the interested question without judgment, and then see what happens and see what the perception of the student at that point was. Because sometimes the student perceives a situation different than you did as an instructor or than you intended. And then the way the student handles the situation might be adequate, while you had something else in mind. So you need to check the perception. Yeah. And if you did this, then you can have like a more in-depth reflection type of conversation.
Yes. You called it in the Dutch part, you called it the curious question, eh? To be really curious about why people behave like, as they behave, isn't it?
Yeah, but if you say curious question, it almost implies that the question in itself is curious. But I understand
So
exactly what
yeah,
you're saying. So
yeah,
you're curious about why somebody acts like he
yeah,
acts.
yeah, exactly.
So you have this kind of innate interest in the other's way of thinking without judgment. So
Yeah,
you really want to dive into what did you see? What was your motivation? What did you do this? Why did you do that? And can you explain to me? Can you make me understand why you did what you did?
yes,
So that in itself are the three stages. And you can actually go to a fourth stage, which is being available or being there in the operational practice as an instructor. So if you go to the operational practice, you'd have uh, you'd have even more complexity. You have more uh, uh, room for this type of thinking about being interested in the other's decision making. And then even in that situation, it's even more important to postpone judgment, because you really want to be interested in what did you see, why did you do what you did, and maybe even the instructor can learn at that point more than he already knew about how things operate in the field.
yes,
So it's like a win-win kind of
yeah,
situation, learning for both the instructor and the student.
yes. And there is a lot of flexibility, not in the beginning, what I found out. So first, when you became a user force instructor, it's a little bit like gray and no, black and white. You follow the steps. But later on, of course, you can also start, as you already mentioned in the Dutch part, you can also start with a scenario as a, how do you call it, as a diagnostic tool. And to see,
Yeah,
do we need more knowledge? Do we need more skills? Do we need some role playing? Or can we just, yeah,
yeah, exactly. So if you do decide to start off with a complete scenario, for instance, you can have like a really good feel about where the gaps are of knowledge and skills that the people require to actually really adequately act in this type of scenario. And that type of information, this diagnostic scenario, would help to develop and create a chain of lessons or or exercises or activities. And in some cases, that requires, for instance, skills training, because you have noticed that some certain types of skills aren't even adequate in this
yeah,
scenario. But what is very important though is that you never go too far back. So you're not going to learn somebody something that he already knows, or she. So that's not necessary. Just go back to the level that somebody needs to learn.
yeah,
And if that part or that whole range is learned, you go to the next phase and to the next phase and to the next phase. So
yeah.
that's the growth that you make.
Yes. And from the other, for approaching from the other side, Pascal, and we didn't talk about it in the Dutch part, but from the other part, as a training designer, you can start actually in the operational context, see what is happening there, what are kind of scenarios are officers encountered with, and so you can go back and eventually ask what are the skills and knowledge needed, isn't it?
Exactly, that's exactly true. So
Yeah,
in the Netherlands, we talk about a ladder
yeah,
or the steps. So you have like a ladder up and a ladder down. So if this is like the operational context, and down here is like the basic skills and knowledge, you'd have to look at the operational situation and see what happens there. What is realistic here? And if you know what's realistic here, you can see what kind of scenarios, exactly like you said, and then walk the way back down to the basic skills.
yeah.
Yeah.
And
And
and I think one of the fallacies we have had was that in the training design, instructors started with the skills. So they were not they did not start with the operational context, but just started with the skills and knowledge part. And most of the time, it were the skills that they were karate or they were kickboxing or boxers or they were good with shooting, and then they started doing their own kind of hobby, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So sometimes you have a competition between knowledge fields and skill fields, and that's really a waste of time, because
Yeah,
you really don't want to talk about karate or judo or jiu-jitsu or kickboxing or UFC or whatever, because you want to talk about how can this student apply the tactics and the skills needed in an operational context within the boundaries of the law
yeah,
and within even the boundaries of morals and ethics.
yeah,
So if you talk about this, then it's not really important which kind of martial arts is like the fundamental skill set that you require. What you need to look at, what does the person need? And sometimes this is judo or jiu-jitsu, because it's about controlling someone, it's about stretching an arm, it's about pushing, keeping someone to the ground, but it doesn't require a black belt level. So it's at a certain point you say, okay, this is enough, you're skilled enough, let's go to the role playing.
yeah,
And see if you can apply this type of technique with approaching a person, opening a door, having a talk, and when you finally have him in handcuffs, transport him to a car. So the skills required, the knowledge required, are always in context with the operational situation.
yes. And so it became a great, how do you say it? Kapstok. It's not an English word, but for instructors, it gave some structure, where to start, how to move further, and I have always found it very informative for me as an instructor. And later on, of course, as always, you can play with it. There is
Yeah.
some other aspect. You talk a lot about the importance of co-creation as a characteristic for transfer and for yeah. Can you talk a
Yeah.
little bit about the importance of co-creation in training, but
Yeah.
also more important in knowledge in general?
Yeah. I believe it's like a more or less educated opinion, but I believe that co-creation and participation is required to adopt or to absorb knowledge. Because in certain areas, and at sometimes there's like a competition between knowledge. So you'd have like a load of knowledge based on your operational experience, for instance, and then at the same time somebody publishes a research based on experiments done with 1,000 police officers, and something else comes across as being the best way to do a certain thing. And this might even be totally different than what you do in this type of situation. And then you'd have like a little competition. Am I going to leave my experience behind, or my ideas about how to act behind, and absorb this new knowledge? Or will I just push the new knowledge away and say, well, I've always done it this way and it works for me, so I'm not going to do anything else? And what's required is a form of co-creation where people feel more or less like an owner of the new knowledge. So if there's research or there's a certain type of knowledge from an instructor, then it helps if the students can have a say in this type of knowledge and this type of skills training, and develop like a training together. So not only in dispersion of scientific knowledge is this important, but also in the creation of your own training.
Yes.
So if you have like an hour and a half to train a certain aspect, do involve the students.
Yes.
And co-create with them the training. This requires a certain type of and a certain amount of experience, because you'd have your goals. Those are really more or less set in stone. But the way to approach these goals can be very different. And the goal is not do this karate chop like this, or do this front kick like this. That's not the goal. The goal is see to it that this suspect gets in handcuffs without being hurt, and without you and your buddy being hurt.
Yes.
How can we do this? And then a form of co-creation can take place with your group.
Yeah.
But this also goes for instance, policy change. So if you have policy change within the law enforcement community, which is related to use of force, how does this land? How does this get absorbed within the use of force practitioners? I think it can only have a place if there's a form of co-creation.
Yes. And how do we, because you also, I think you are also a scientist in the sense that you do research, and nowadays even more, and you were a team chef at the knowledge and research department, so you came across all those research. And besides co-creation, do you have any other thoughts about bridging the gap? Because there is a lot of knowledge which doesn't land, but there is also, I think, a lot of experience in the real training world, where scientists maybe should be more sensitive to.
Yeah, so we talked about the operations and training, but if you add the third layer, which is science, then you'd have like a triangle, and you need to put those together, because all three can have like a sort of competition. And I believe that if you have like a knowledge community, or another type of community where science and practice and teaching can come together and coexist, and think about research questions, think about the research domain, then you'd have like a win-win-win situation.
Yes.
Where everybody feels owner of the outcome. So I think that part is very important for really internalizing or absorbing new knowledge. But it also requires a third perspective. So it's not about my perspective versus your perspective. It's about co-creating a third perspective, which incorporates my perspective and your perspective, or at least takes into account. So that also requires a certain dialogue between us.
Yeah.
So I really need to understand where you're coming from and what your basic assumptions are, and why you're hanging on to this point. And I need to express why I'm where my perspective comes from, and then together we could more or less come to a third perspective. That's what I believe.
Yeah. So now we have talked about a kind of structure in the use of force training model, which was created for the instructors to move from knowledge and skills to role-playing with more context, to even more context in scenario-based training, where we invite students to ask questions about decision-making. And then we can even move further, that we that we go with them on the streets and to reflect with them on the use of force. The decision making, I know you have also a special interest in the moral part of that. I'm not sure if you wrote a, how do you call it? You wrote a paper, not a paper.
Master's thesis.
Master thesis about it. Is it? Can you summarize it just in 1 minute? What did you study and what was the outcome?
It was about it was called Moral Compass, and the role of moral knowledge when Dutch police officers decide to use their firearms. So what is the place of moral knowledge in this context? And what you see is that in a lot of contexts, especially when there's like self-defense situations, knowledge does not really play a role, because it's too difficult, it's too cognitive. So they fall back on skills, intuition, instinct, and often that would be all right within the boundaries of the law, and it would be okay. But it wasn't really that they more or less walk down some sort of list and see, check this, and check that. And also another part which is really important is perception. So you can only act moral if you have an accurate a perception of a situation. And sometimes the stress or the situation is difficult. It's vague. It may be even dark. And in hindsight, you if you know all the aspects, you can have you made a different decision. But within the situation that you perceive, you try to act as moral as you can. And a misperception can lead to immoral behavior, even though the person in itself isn't immoral and didn't intend to be immoral. And this is a very important part of training and perceiving and also training perception within your models that you use.
So we can do that by asking the mental frames for example, in scenario training. Is that a good thing to and then especially the moral aspects of the situation? Is it one way of doing it?
Yeah, that could be one way, but there's also something that's called bounded ethicality, which makes it difficult for a person to review its own ethical decision, because you'd always be more positive about your ethical decision. It's about protecting the ego and the identity that you have, but it's also about, if you project your behavior in a new situation, you'd be more ethical in the projection than you'd probably be in real life. And that's really human. So it's not a bad thing in itself, but it's really human. So you'd have like a bias in this situation. So yeah, the only thing that's available is this type of reflective conversation. You'd also have to bear in mind that people are more positive about their own behavior than in real life. So that also means that there's a risk of a type of moral injury when they act immoral.
Yeah.
Because they never expected of themselves to do this. And morality or ethical decision making is really complex, because in most cases it's in hindsight that you have all the aspects in a sort of clear view, which makes it easier to have like a standpoint.
Yes.
That's why if you have this in training, and this is really difficult to discuss in training because it takes a lot of time, but it's also difficult for the person to look inwards on this account, then you really have to always ask perception. So what did you see? What's the type of situation that you think you were in? That has to be the first question.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. Well, you're interested in this topic, and I guess you like to research it more, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. The implementation in training. I think internationally this is also a huge topic, of course, and I would love to see one day how we can, as use of force instructors, to also take this into account, and how can we prepare our participants in making these decisions.
Yeah, I'll be more than happy to oblige.
So, Pascal, thank you very much. We did a short recap of our Dutch conversation, and shedding some light on the phases of use of force instruction, and the asking the right questions about co-creation, and we ended with the importance of the moral aspects of police work. So thank you very much, and I hope to see you again, of course, and maybe for listeners, if they are interested internationally, maybe they can reach out to you.
Absolutely. Yeah, feel free.
Okay, thank you, Pascal. I will end this conversation right now. Thank you also, listeners, and I hope you enjoyed the conversations, and I hope you have some inspiring insights or things to do tomorrow in your training.